Hi, it's Nicole, and today I want to talk about Useful Work versus Useless Toil by William Morris. I picked this up when visiting friends in London who lived quite near to the William Morris House slash museum in Walthamstow. And visiting the museum was actually really interesting to me. Even if you're not fully aware of it, you've probably seen some of the works of William Morris, those beautiful botanical patterns that might be on notebooks or pillows or wallpaper and so on. And it's interesting to see how highly commercialized those are compared to some of his views on mass production. But this book was a very interesting read for me. Not least of all because it helped to solidify some thoughts that I'd already been having, but it also just kind of brought the past fully into the present for me, as this was written in the late 1800s and yet so many of the ideas in here are still relevant today. And I think there's also what feels like quite a modern way of thinking in the way that he writes. So it opens with the title essay of Useful Work versus Useless Toil, and William Morris tries to explain what exactly is useful work and that everything outside of that realm constitutes useless toil. And I think in like the first paragraph maybe he even talks about how we praise work to the point where it almost doesn't matter what the work is as long as people are working, that's praised, but tends to be praised the most by those who don't have to do any of that work. In that title essay, William Morris talks about hope and these three hopes that are key to whether or not work is useful. Those hopes are the hope of rest, and that rest will be restorative. The second is hope of product, and that product will also be useful and valuable and not only able to be used by, I think he words it, a fool or an ascetic. And then the third hope is the hope of pleasure in the work itself. It can't just be that the work is missed because it was habit, but when taken away, that work is missed because it was valuable in and of itself to do the thing, and it was pleasurable to do the work itself. And I find that a really good starting point for when we look at the work that we do in the world and the kinds of work that we are erasing versus the kinds of work that we are pushing people towards. Another interesting thing that he brings up is the splitting of the greater arts and the lesser arts being decorative arts and essentially the kinds of art that we interact with every day, versus the greater arts, which are the loftier works that are essentially separated from any practical use that they may have. So you're thinking of like grand paintings and murals and statues and sculpture and things like that. He mentions that the splitting of the artist and the handicraftsman hurts both parties because the handicraftsman is then left without hope of elevation, and the artist is left without hope of intelligent industriousness and usefulness. It was interesting as well for me to have this man who is a proponent of the decorative arts talk about how nothing can be art if it is not useful. And I think what feels interesting about that to me is the fact that when we think of decoration or decorative arts, we certainly don't, or I don't think about usefulness necessarily. It seems superficial, like just even by its definition, it's like this superficial thing that you just stick on to something that is useful. And yet I think we probably need to reframe that. And he talks about how the things that we interact with every day need to be beautiful and bring us some joy in some way in order to make the work that we do with those things, or whatever it is that we do with those things, also be I suppose pleasurable in some way to us. The title essay is only one of 4 that's in this tiny book. Other essays are on Gothic architecture, the lesser arts, and how he became a socialist. These might seem like they're not entirely connected initially, and yet I feel reading each of these essays one after another, I could see the links between them. There are things from the very start that lead quite neatly, I think, into the final essay about socialism and why he's a socialist. When you look at him saying things throughout about how art and education and so on should be accessible to everyone, that leads quite neatly into his politics. And more broadly than that, the role that art plays in our lives is political. Like, everything is political, obviously, everything in our lives is political, but in order to have the arts integrated into our lives in certain ways, you cannot help but be political. And his discussion on Gothic architecture looks at the superficiality of these aesthetics and how we divorce them from their use, and how certain aesthetics are beautiful in a place and time, but when removed from that place and time and removed from their history, they become just shallow, and you could say they become potentially tools of propaganda. And it was interesting for me to see a perspective directly from the time that starts to explain the Victorian fascination with the Middle Ages as well. And I think he does a good job of talking about that and explaining that. He is a proponent of it, and I can see why. And I think it also lends to a wider story about why we borrow from certain places, or what story we're trying to tell when we do that. And also the appropriateness of that. The appropriateness of certain aesthetics when you remove them from the place that they originated. What do they come to mean? All of this I found fascinating. That said, for me it was interesting to see that he is someone who appreciates art and nature and history and values them so greatly, and yet seems not that bothered about science, when I feel like science goes along with, certainly with at least with nature, but science is something that I value very greatly. I don't begrudge it in the least. He seems to see it as something that has been co-opted by commerce, and I understand that completely. Like, he talks about, you know, science is too busy looking at solving these issues of commerce when it could be solving the issue of pollution, for example. We see that today. And so I understand that perspective. I understand why he's not that interested in science, but I think that science has a very important role to play in all of the things that we value as human beings. I think that it's not just the servant of commerce, any more so than art is. But obviously there's a lot we need to look at in how we are using science and art to service the wrong goals in humanity. I'm saying wrong. I'm sure some people think that commerce is the thing that the world does and should revolve around. I disagree with that completely. So this book, I found a lot that I agreed with in it, but it also brought me a lot of new ideas to think about, or new framings to think about, and I found that very valuable. For me, this is probably a favorite in terms of looking at, like I said, bringing past to present and seeing how relevant a lot of these old ideas still are. It was really valuable looking at his thoughts on labor and his thoughts on art, but I think there are one or maybe two sentences in this that have a bit of a hint of anti-Arab sentiment that I was very uncomfortable with, and so I wouldn't be able to give it like a 5 out of 5 stars because it's just hard to ignore that. And I realize that, like, whenever I pick up a book from this time period, particularly one written by a white male author, I tend to expect or accept that there's probably going to be some manner of racist ideas or something like that that I'm gonna have to be faced with at some point, and it is disappointing, honestly. It's particularly disappointing when you come across someone who purports to have socialist ideas and purports to think that, you know, art and all of these beautiful things in the world should be accessible to everyone, education should be accessible to everyone, and yet there are still exclusions in their minds and barriers up and stuff that are just completely arbitrary. that really seems like a shame. It's like, I guess he's a smart guy, but he's not that smart. You know what I mean? Like, it just feels very upsetting. So I would still call this a favorite in terms of the ideas on art and labor and other thoughts and things like that, and I really did appreciate it, and there was a lot that I gained from reading this, but that aspect was also there, and that's a shame, and I didn't like that part, so there's that. Would I recommend it though? I absolutely would. I would recommend it to anyone who's in the arts and anyone who's interested in art, but also anyone who wants to more deeply understand, why do we work? What are we working for? What is the value in work? All of those things. So that's that's all of the thoughts I can think of at the moment. That said, this is the first book that I fully launched into trying to shift away from recording my thoughts and responses to books on something like Goodreads or Storygraph or anything online, and I actually moved towards a physical reading journal. I'm not sure right now exactly how I feel about that. I also, by the end, because I didn't start recording anything until, I don't know, I was quite a ways into this, maybe about 10 pages from the end or something, but I started making notes in my book, which I don't generally like to do, not so much because I don't like marking my books, but more so because I find that such a scattered way to access my notes. I like the fact that when I'm recording things digitally, it's very easy to access what I've noted down, but I wanted to give this physical journaling thing for my reading a go, and so I have made loads of notes about my thoughts or writing down quotes and stuff from the book, and it's been interesting to see how that kind of slows me down even more, but is it worth it? Maybe, I don't know. But I do feel like having recorded notes from this book as well as some of the other books that I'm reading on craft, all in the same space, is probably going to be interesting to see how those notes talk to each other. But that's all I think I have to say on that for now, and I'll see you again next time. Bye.